Capitol Hill. In a chamber packed with tension, Jasmine Crockett faces off against J.D. Vance over a map showing 12,487 voters erased from the rolls in just 3 districts. The air cracks as accusations fly, evidence hits the table, and the balance of power teeters in real time. Every face in the room knows what these numbers mean and who they point to. But when the truth is finally cornered, will it fight or will it fall? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was lit in a harsh, surgical white that made every face look sharper, every flaw more exposed. J.D. Vance sat rigid in his chair, a tailored suit worth a small fortune hugging his frame, gold pen poised like a weapon. In front of him, glossy files lay in perfect order, each marked with precise golden tabs. His eyes were steady, smug, the kind of look that said he'd already decided how this day would end. The doors opened. Jasmine Crockett entered. Black suit, clean lines, no frills. In her hand, a single slim case, locked, giving away nothing. Her steps were firm, heels striking the marble in crisp, deliberate beats. She didn't glance at J.D., not once, even as he let out a slow, mocking smile. Around them, the low murmur of the committee buzzed like static before a storm. It didn't feel like a meeting. It felt like a battlefield. The gavel's sharp crack still vibrated through the air when J.D. Vance rose from his seat, not with the slow deliberation of a man respecting protocol, but with the sudden, forceful motion of someone seizing the floor before anyone could stop him. He didn't wait for the chairman's formalities, didn't offer so much as a glance of acknowledgement to the committee. No greeting, no soft preamble. He moved like a man who believed that rules were for other people. In his right hand, a sleek black folder glinted under the cold surgical white lights, the gold clasp catching every beam like a predator's eye. He didn't lay it down carefully. He dropped it. A flat, heavy smack against the polished wood. A sound that rang through the chamber like the cocking of a gun. Heads turned toward him in unison. The folder lay there like a sealed indictment, its weight more symbolic than physical. "I have evidence," he declared, his voice carrying with the kind of controlled projection that fills a room without the need to shout. The words were steady, each syllable honed and deliberate, sliding into the air like blades meant to cut. With a crisp, almost theatrical flick of his wrist, he opened the folder. Inside was a stack of glossy pages, their edges lined with neat, color-coded tabs. Red, yellow, blue, like a general's battle map. Without glancing at anyone, J.D. began to read. His tone was precise, each number hit with the same force as a verdict. Precinct 42B, lost 1,137 ballots. District 7C, another 984 missing. He paused only long enough for the echo of each figure to settle into the minds around him before moving on. Entire blocks of votes, gone. The words dripped finality as if he were closing a door on the truth itself. Then he lifted his head, his eyes locked onto Jasmine Crockett's across the table. A deliberate measuring look meant to bait her, to see the smallest twitch of unease. She gave him nothing. That lack of reaction seemed to fuel him further. He returned his gaze to the report, flipping another page with a sharp, practiced snap, his gold pen tapping against the paper in time with his words. "Thousands of ballots," he said, leaning into the phrase as though he were feeding it extra weight. "And where are these ballots missing from? Districts leaning toward Mrs. Crockett's opponent." His voice sharpened here, rising just enough to slice through the low rustle of papers and murmurs in the gallery. Then came the strike he'd been building toward, delivered clean, with the cold efficiency of a man dropping the last piece into a trap. "Mrs. Crockett is not just a lawbreaker, she's a threat to democracy." The sentence landed like a live round. For a moment, the air in the room seemed heavier, the stillness taut. A few committee members nodded almost instinctively, their expressions hardening in her direction. Others simply stared, eyes narrowed, weighing the accusation in the balance of their own judgment. Jasmine didn't blink. Her hands rested lightly on the single, slim black case before her, her shoulders square, her breathing slow and even. She didn't reach for the microphone, didn't shuffle a single paper. Instead, she lowered her chin ever so slightly, a small, deliberate nod. Not a nod of agreement, not submission, but acknowledgement. The kind of precise, controlled gesture that says, "I've heard you. I'll answer when I'm ready. And when I do, it will matter." The cameras caught it. So did JD. And for the briefest flicker of a second, his pen stopped tapping. The tension from JD's accusation still clung to the air like static when Jasmine slowly leaned forward, her movements deliberate, unhurried, and precise. The kind of composure that turns heads before a single word is spoken. Her hand pressed the microphone button with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the charged silence. "Mr. Chairman, I request the floor." The low murmur in the chamber cut off instantly. Every gaze swung toward her, some expectant, some skeptical. She didn't so much as glance at the committee. Her eyes locked on JD, steady and unflinching, as if she were lining him up in her sights. "Before I address anything he's just said," she began, her tone even but carrying the cold edge of a scalpel, "I want the source of this so-called evidence verified." Her words didn't invite cooperation. They demanded it. A staffer slid the folder across the polished wood toward her. She caught it with one hand, the motion clean and economical, then flipped it open with the other. The stiff, glossy pages gave a faint crack as she spread them out, her gaze sweeping across the columns and footnotes. Each turn of the page was slow enough to register, but fast enough to signal she already knew what she was looking for. When she finally looked up, her expression hadn't changed, but her voice shifted. No longer the request of a participant, but the precise dissection of a surgeon exposing rot. "First," she said, the single word snapping in the air, "your report spells 2 precinct names wrong. That doesn't happen in official records." She tapped the page once, the sound sharp. "Second, you've listed street addresses that do not exist on any county roll." Another tap, harder this time. "Third, you've marked several voters as deceased, yet according to both census data and current utility accounts, they are alive, well, and paying their bills." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her eyes dropped to another section, and she flipped a page with a flick of her wrist. "Fourth, you've assigned the same precinct code to 2 completely different counties in the same week. That is not just irregular. That is logistically impossible under election protocol." She let the words hang for a beat before delivering the last strike. "And fifth, your reported vote totals are timestamped before the registration updates they're supposedly based on even occurred. That's not an error, Mr. Vance. That's fabricated." The room seemed to draw in on itself, the silence thickening. Jasmine leaned in, her voice lowering into a deadly calm, each syllable deliberate. "If you want to play prosecutor, learn not to use fabricated data from your own fundraising office." The sentence landed with the weight of a hammer. JD's gold pen, which had been tapping in a steady rhythm throughout, froze midair. His confident smirk flattened into a tight, thin line. His posture stiffened, and for the first time since he'd stood up, there was the faintest flicker. Not of anger, but of recognition that the ground beneath him had shifted. The sting of Jasmine's last strike was still hanging in the air when JD leaned back in his chair, a slow, deliberate smirk cutting across his face. He didn't reach for the report this time. He didn't bother with numbers. Instead, he went for the kind of attack meant to draw blood in front of an audience. His voice dropped into a tone thick with condescension, each word sharpened for maximum insult. "You know, Mrs. Crockett," he began, drawing her name out like a formality he barely respected. "Where you come from, you might have enough to play lawyer in some small county courthouse. But you don't understand the mechanics of a national election." A few members of the committee shifted in their seats, some exchanging quick glances. JD caught it and doubled down. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, eyes locked on hers. His grin widened into something more like a sneer. Then came the laugh, low, dismissive, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to humiliate. "You can fool the people in your little neighborhood," he said, his words landing slow and deliberate. "But you can't fool us." The phrase hit the air like the slam of a cell door, intended to confine her in the box he'd built. For a moment, Jasmine didn't move. Then she rose, unhurried, the scrape of her chair legs against the polished floor loud in the stillness. Every eye followed her as she straightened to her full height. She didn't answer him with words. Instead, she reached down to the slim black case resting by her side, unfastening it with a click that echoed in the quiet chamber. Her hands slid inside, fingers wrapping around a single heavy fold of paper. She stepped forward, heels striking the marble in sharp, rhythmic beats, and laid the document flat on the table with a snap of her wrist. The thick sheet unfolded to reveal a full-scale election district map. Not a copy, but the original. Its paper dense and weighty, stamped in red with the unmistakable FBI seal. Under the harsh white light, its details burned into view. Boundaries drawn with surgical precision, neighborhoods shaded in neat, deliberate color, except for the hollow patches. Those patches were impossible to ignore. Whole communities were stripped bare from the voter rolls, their names and votes erased as if they had never existed. Jasmine's hand came down on one of the empty spaces, palm pressing flat, fingers splayed like she was holding it in place for the entire room to see. The murmurs died instantly. No one looked at JD now. Every eye was locked on the map and on the woman standing over it. The map dominated the table, its clean lines and shaded districts marred by glaring blank spaces that stood out like missing pieces of a crime scene. Jasmine leaned in, her shadow cutting across the paper, and began her strike. She didn't wave broadly. She went street by street, block by block, her fingertip landing with sharp, deliberate taps. "This neighborhood," she said, tapping the first hollow space. "Gone." She moved to the next, her voice unyielding. "And this one, gone." Her pace quickened, each tap hitting like a drumbeat, until she stopped, looked up at JD Vance, and delivered it in full. 12,487 citizens lost their right to vote, a perfect match with the districts where your campaign benefits. The weight of the number hung in the air like a stone dropped in deep water. A few members of the committee leaned forward instinctively, their chairs creaking as they bent over the map. Fingers traced precinct codes, eyes darted between the blank patches and the corresponding voter data. Expressions shifted, curiosity giving way to unease, then to something harder. JD's chair groaned as he leaned forward, drawing breath as if to cut her off. But before a word could leave his mouth, Jasmine's voice sliced back in, calm but loaded with finality. "And we know who signed this order." Her hand left the map and went to the slim black case at her side. She unfastened it with a quiet, deliberate click, reached in, and drew out a thick tabbed file. She laid it on the table with a flat, heavy thud. The kind of sound that told the room whatever came next wasn't just paper. It was going to be the kind of evidence no one could walk away from. The weight of the thick, tabbed file was still pressing into the polished wood when Jasmine's hand moved again. Not toward the papers, but to the inside pocket of her jacket. The shift was small, almost casual, but in the brittle silence of the hearing room, every eye followed it. Her fingers closed around something metallic and compact, and when she drew it out, the object gleamed under the cold white light. It was a small matte black recorder, no bigger than her palm, its brushed steel edges catching a faint, lethal glint. She didn't announce what it was. She didn't need to. Jasmine set it down in the exact center of the unfolded FBI stamped map, right over one of the hollow districts she'd just exposed. The placement was deliberate, surgical, as if she were pinning a bullet to the crime scene. For a moment, her thumb rested lightly on the play button. She looked up at the committee, then across the table to JD, holding his gaze for a beat too long. The corner of her mouth tightened, not into a smile, but into the faint, restrained expression of someone about to open a door they knew their opponent could never close again. The click when she pressed play was soft, almost delicate, but in the tension-heavy room, it sounded like the pulling of a trigger. A moment of static hissed from the tiny speaker, and then the voice came. J.D. Vance's voice. Clear, unfiltered, unmistakable. "Cut their names, don't let them vote. They're not going to vote for me." The words didn't just land, they detonated. They came sharp and decisive, not the cautious language of a politician, but the blunt order of a man certain he wouldn't be heard outside trusted walls. And then following the sentence came the sound that turned it from damning to devastating. A short, low chuckle. Not a laugh of amusement, but one of contempt. The kind of laugh that told you he didn't just see this as strategy, he saw it as dominance. It was like the oxygen had been sucked from the room. The murmurs that had been building earlier died instantly. The ambient sounds, the faint hum of the overhead lights, the shifting of papers, the occasional scrape of a chair, seemed to vanish. Every single person in the room was frozen in place, caught between disbelief and the recognition that they had just heard the truth, in the man's own voice, with no filter, no spin. The reaction from the committee was almost cinematic. One member's pen stopped mid-note, the ink pooling into a dark blot on his page. Another slowly turned his head toward JD, his mouth slightly open, his eyes scanning the man's face like he was looking for a crack in the armor. A woman in a dark navy suit leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to something sharper. The kind of quiet, restrained judgment that was more dangerous than any outburst. And then, breaking the silence, came the sound of a chair leg scraping hard against the floor in the back of the room. It drew every head toward the gallery. An elderly man stood there, tall despite his years, his hair silver white, his posture ramrod straight. His face was lined but not weak. His eyes burned with something old and unshakable. When he spoke, his voice was deep and steady, each word landing with the weight of lived history. "I'm one of them," he said, his gaze locked on JD. "I bled for the right to vote, and you took it away." There was no tremor in his tone, no dramatics, just the raw, unvarnished truth from a man who had carried the cost of that right in his own blood. For a moment, the image hung in the air. The old veteran standing in the back row, the man at the center of the table with sweat starting to bead along his hairline, and the small recorder still on the map, replaying the ugly truth for anyone who doubted what they'd heard. JD's face had changed. The confident lines were gone, replaced by a pale, flat expression that couldn't quite decide whether to settle into denial or panic. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin waxy under the harsh lights. A faint sheen of sweat had begun to gather at his temple, catching the glare every time he shifted. His gold pen, the one he had been spinning so casually earlier, now lay motionless in front of him. He didn't speak. Maybe he knew there was nothing to say that could scrape the sound of his own voice from the memory of the room. Maybe the heat on the back of his neck from the committee stares made speech impossible. The sweat line at his hairline was growing, a slow trail working its way down toward his jaw. Jasmine hadn't moved since pressing play. Her hands rested lightly on the table, palms down, not in aggression but in total control. She didn't need to say another word. Not yet. The voice from the recorder had done what no cross-examination, no argument, no document could do. It had shown them J.D. Vance unmasked, and it had left him nowhere to stand. The old man in the back hadn't sat down yet. His eyes stayed locked on J.D. like a fixed sight line, unblinking, unflinching. The silence he left after his words was just as damning as the sentence itself. In that moment, the hearing chamber didn't feel like a political room anymore. It felt like a court, and the man in the witness chair had just been convicted by his own mouth. The veteran's words had barely faded when the chairman's hand gripped the gavel, his knuckles whitening around the handle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was so taut with silence that every syllable he spoke landed like the drop of a hammer. "Clerk," he said, turning his head slightly toward the stenographer's desk, "enter an emergency minute and refer this matter for criminal investigation, effective immediately." It was the kind of instruction that carried no hesitation, no space for argument. The clerk's hands snapped into action, fingers pounding keys in quick succession, the sound rapid and metallic, echoing in the chamber like gunfire. A red folder was pulled from the side of the desk with a violent flick, its edges snapping against the wood. The record light on the official camera shifted from steady to a slow, deliberate pulse, a signal to everyone watching that this was no longer just a hearing. This was evidence being logged in real time. At the far end of the table, J.D. Vance twitched in his seat. He leaned forward toward his microphone, the motion jerky, unplanned. His lips parted, and the first words stumbled out like they'd been tripped on the way. This is taken out of context. But the sound was different now. Gone was the crisp, commanding tone he had started the morning with. In its place was something thin, frayed, and unsteady. His voice cracked on the last word, the syllables collapsing into a rasp. No one looked convinced. In fact, no one looked moved at all. The chairman didn't so much as blink. The members of the committee didn't shift in their seats. The gallery, packed and tense, didn't so much as murmur. It wasn't that they were ignoring him. It was that his voice no longer had the gravity to pull their attention away from the evidence still sitting on the table. The FBI stamped map, the damning file, the black recorder, all laid out like exhibits in a courtroom. "Let the record reflect the referral," the chairman said, his eyes fixed on J.D. The statement wasn't loud, but it might as well have been a final seal pressed into hot wax. On the stenographer's page, the words formed a clean, unbroken line, one that would now live forever in the official record. J.D. shifted again, trying to stand. The movement was abrupt, his knee bumping the underside of the table and jostling the map. As he rose halfway, his hand caught the edge of his gold pen, sending it spinning across the surface, before it dropped to the floor with a sharp metallic clink. The sound snapped through the air like a spark, small, but impossible to ignore. Heads turned toward him instinctively, tracking his fumbling motion to retrieve it, but he didn't bend down. Two security officers stepped forward from their posts along the wall. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Their movements were smooth, synchronized, the quiet confidence of men who had done this 100 times. In a matter of steps, they flanked J.D.'s table, one to the left, one to the right, their dark uniforms a stark contrast against the bright, sterile light of the hearing room. They stood tall, hands clasped loosely in front of them, but their presence was undeniable. They weren't blocking his way yet, but they had closed the space around him with surgical precision, making it clear that the path to the door now belonged to them. J.D.'s mouth opened again, but nothing came out. His jaw moved, forming words that never found voice. His eyes darted once toward the officers, then toward the chairman, then back down to the table as if the papers there might still offer him a defense. A bead of sweat rolled from his temple, cutting a slow path down his cheek before vanishing into the crease of his jaw. The rest of the room didn't move. The committee sat still, their expressions unreadable, but their attention locked on the scene unfolding in front of them. The audience in the gallery from the front row to the back leaned forward ever so slightly, drawn in not by noise or chaos, but by the cold, controlled inevitability of what was happening. The weight of the chairman's order hung over everything. This wasn't political theater anymore. This wasn't a clash of rhetoric. The moment had crossed a line into something harder, more final. The kind of moment where careers don't just falter, they end. And in the center of it all, J.D. Vance sat caught between two silent officers, his own voice reduced to an unsteady shadow of what it had been minutes before. As the machinery of the investigation began to move without him, the chairman's voice still hung in the air, heavy as iron, his order for an immediate criminal referral echoing in the collective mind of the chamber. The two security officers remained in position, one on each side of J.D. Vance's table, silent sentinels closing the invisible perimeter around him. The tension in the room was a taut wire, humming under the weight of what had just unfolded. The FBI stamped map, the damning file, the black recorder replaying his own words for all to hear. J.D. sat rigid, eyes down, his once confident posture now a brittle shell. His gold pen lay forgotten on the floor where it had fallen, glinting under the cold light like a discarded weapon. The silence that followed was not an empty one. It was loaded, the kind that presses into the skin and makes every sound sharper, every breath louder. It was into that silence that Jasmine Crockett moved. She didn't rush. She didn't glance at the cameras, or at the committee, or at the still buzzing red record light in the corner. She simply placed her hands on the edge of the table in front of her and pushed her chair back. The scrape of its legs against the polished floor was low, but deliberate, a friction that sliced through the stillness. Every head turned toward her, Drawn by the inevitability of what was coming, she rose in one smooth motion, her back straight, her chin lifted just enough to meet the room at eye level. There was nothing theatrical in the movement, no flourish, no wasted energy. But there was authority, a quiet, unshakable authority that seemed to gather the space around her. She stood there for a heartbeat, letting the weight of the moment catch up to her presence. Her fingertips brushed the top edge of the map spread before her, tracing the thick paper as if grounding herself in the evidence she had laid out. Her gaze moved slowly, deliberately, sweeping from the farthest row of the gallery to the semicircle of committee members, making eye contact where she could. No one looked away. Then her eyes came to rest, briefly but sharply, on J.D. Vance. He didn't meet her gaze. When she spoke, her voice cut clean through the room. She didn't need to shout. The steel in her tone carried farther than volume ever could. "The right to vote is not a bargaining chip," she said, the words emerging with the deliberate force of something she had thought about long before this day. Her voice was even, but there was no mistaking the current running through it. The charge of conviction, of anger honed into precision. "It is the breath of this democracy." She paused there, not for effect, but to let the sentence land where it needed to. It was the kind of pause that forced people to feel the weight of what had been said, to sit with it before the next blow came. The air felt thicker. A few in the gallery shifted in their seats, but no one looked away. Her eyes swept the room again, locking briefly with members of the committee, with the staff at their desks, with the security officers still standing at the ready. Then, without raising her voice, she delivered the line that would carve itself into the memory of everyone who heard it. "And anyone who takes that breath away will pay the price." The last four words fell like a gavel. Not a request, not a plea, but a sentence. There was an audible difference in the room after she said it, a subtle shift in posture among those listening, as though the declaration had physically settled onto their shoulders. She hadn't just condemned the act, she had named the cost. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The silence returned, but it wasn't the brittle tension from before. This was something else, a silence of processing, of people trying to reconcile what they had just heard with what they had seen that morning. Jasmine stood unmoving, her stance solid, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if anchoring herself there. Then from somewhere in the back of the gallery, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, almost cautious, but in the vacuum of the moment, it landed like the first drop of rain on dry earth. All eyes turned briefly toward the source. A middle-aged man in a dark coat, his face unreadable but his hands steady in their rhythm. A second pair joined in, this one from the opposite side of the gallery. The two claps began to overlap, finding a rhythm, and then a third set of hands added to it. The applause began to travel forward, row by row, picking up confidence as it moved. It was still slow, deliberate, not yet swelling into a roar, but it was growing. In the committee's semicircle, a few members glanced at each other, measuring the moment. No one moved to stop it. The chairman sat still, his hands folded, watching Jasmine over the rising sound. Even those who had sat stone-faced through the hearing couldn't completely mask the shift in the air. A shift from accusation and defense to something larger, something harder to contain. The clapping was louder now, sharper, filling the spaces in the chamber, where moments earlier there had only been the rustle of paper and the scrape of chairs. It climbed the walls, carried by the acoustics of the high ceiling, echoing back down with a warmth that cut against the cold, surgical light. The applause was not for spectacle, it was for survival, for the idea that what had just been said was not rhetoric, but a line drawn, clear and immovable. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't bow her head or acknowledge the clapping in any performative way. She remained exactly as she was, standing straight, eyes forward, her breathing even. The applause might have been for her, but she held herself like someone who knew it was really for the principle she had just defended. In the front row of the gallery, a young woman leaned forward, clapping harder now, her eyes fixed on Jasmine with something between admiration and relief. Behind her, the elderly veteran, who had stood earlier, joined in, his hands coming together with slow but powerful force. The sound of his applause cut through the others, deep and deliberate, like the beat of a drum in a procession. The officers at JD's table remained still, their eyes forward, their expressions neutral. But even in their disciplined composure, there was a subtle acknowledgement, a tiny shift in weight, the faintest softening in the set of their shoulders, as if the room's new rhythm had reached them too. The sound kept building, not in speed but in depth. More hands joined, more faces turned toward Jasmine, and with each passing second, the applause became less about the moment that had just happened and more about the message it carried beyond the walls of the chamber. For the people in that room, it wasn't hard to imagine this sound spilling into the streets, into living rooms, into the places where conversations would be had in the days to come. The power of her words, the right to vote, is not a bargaining chip. It is the breath of this democracy, and anyone who takes that breath away will pay the price. Was already leaving the confines of the hearing room, carried in the memory of every person who had just heard them. The cameras kept rolling, their red lights still burning, catching every second. The fixed strength in Jasmine's posture, the growing swell of hands clapping, the almost imperceptible recoil in JD's body as the tide of the room shifted decisively away from him. And in that moment, under the harsh lights and the watchful eyes, the applause grew louder still, steady, unwavering, inevitable. It rolled forward like a tide that would not recede, filling every corner of the chamber until it was all that could be heard. The applause was still echoing off the chamber walls when the chairman lifted his gavel again, rapping twice, sharp and final. The sound cut through the clapping like a blade, and the room fell back into a heavy, watchful quiet. Papers rustled, chairs creaked, and every eye in the semicircle of the committee turned inward toward the vote that was about to be taken. The chairman's voice was level, but the undercurrent was iron. "We will now move to an immediate vote," he announced. "The motion is to remove J.D. Vance from all participation in the Electoral Oversight Committee, effective immediately." His words were met with no delay. Members glanced at one another, their faces set, pens poised. "All in favor?" Hands went up. First a few, then the rest, each lift carrying the weight of finality. "Opposed?" There was no movement. The clerk's voice recorded it for the record. "The motion carries unanimous." J.D. Vance sat frozen for half a second longer than the moment allowed, his shoulders stiff, his jaw tight. It was as if his mind hadn't caught up with the reality of what had just happened, or perhaps it had, and was refusing to process it. The chairman didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The verdict had been delivered. J.D.'s eyes flicked toward the gallery, then to the committee, but found no friendly faces waiting to meet his gaze. No allies to soften the blow. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. He pushed back his chair slowly, the scrape of its legs dragging across the floor in a sound that seemed to last far too long. The two security officers who had been stationed at his sides stepped in with quiet precision, not touching him, but guiding him in a way that left no doubt he was expected to follow. J.D. gathered nothing. No papers, no pen, not even the water glass that still sat half full in front of him. He kept his eyes low, but the cameras didn't care. The moment his feet crossed the threshold out of the committee circle, the low hum from the press pool outside the hearing room turned into a storm. The heavy doors opened, and the hallway beyond was an assault of white light. Dozens of camera shutters snapped in rapid bursts, their staccato rhythm mixing with the high-pitched pops of flashbulbs exploding over and over. The light was so bright it painted his face in harsh, unflattering contrast. Pale skin, clenched jaw, sweat at his temple, catching the glare like a mirror. Microphones lunged forward on extended arms. Reporters shouting questions over one another, their words indistinct in the din, but their tone unmistakable. Hungry, urgent, unrelenting. J.D. didn't stop. He didn't answer. He moved forward, flanked by the officers, his gaze fixed somewhere far ahead, the way a man looks when he's searching for the quickest way out of a burning building. Behind him, the doors closed slowly, muffling the chaos outside but not erasing it. Inside, the shift in the room was palpable. The air felt less constricted but not relaxed. The weight of what had happened still sat over the table like a shadow. Jasmine Crockett remained standing where she had been, the map and the recorder still in place before her. She didn't rush to move them. For a long moment, she simply looked at them. the physical proof of everything that had been said and done in this chamber. The artifacts of a fight that had just ended here, but would ripple far beyond these walls. Finally, she reached forward. Her hands were steady as she began to fold the large FBI-stamped map, each crease sharp and deliberate. The paper made a crisp sound as it folded in on itself, the bright, damning colors disappearing between layers. She slid it back into its protective case, snapping the closure shut with a quiet click. Next, she picked up the small black recorder, her thumb brushing over its surface for just an instant, before she slipped it into the inner pocket of her jacket. Her eyes swept the room one last time, not as a challenge, but as a statement. The steadiness in her gaze said she wasn't here to savor the moment, but she wasn't stepping away from it either. There was no self-congratulation, no hint of gloating in her expression, only the unyielding calm of someone who had carried a truth into the light and was willing to stand in it, however bright or blinding it became. The chairman gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that needed no words. Around the table, a few committee members shifted, some meeting her eyes briefly, others looking down at their notes, already bracing for the work that would follow. The gallery remained hushed, as if the audience understood they had witnessed something that didn't require commentary. Outside, the flashes continued to pop in the hallway, the reporters still calling out JD's name. Inside, Jasmine slid the strap of her case over her shoulder and straightened, the recorder and the map secured, the weight of both pressing against her like the proof they carried. She took a step back from the table, her movements measured, her presence still commanding even in the aftermath. The hearing was technically over, but the echo of it, like the echo of the applause earlier, wasn't going anywhere. In that stillness, with the doors closed and the storm outside contained, the contrast was stark. J.D. Vance, leaving under a barrage of flashbulbs and unanswered questions. Jasmine Crockett, standing calm and immovable in the room he'd just been removed from. The evidence now in her hands, her eyes fixed on what came next. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone present knew it. And though the room would empty in minutes, the image of her, steady, unshaken, and holding the truth, was the one that would leave with them. The doors had barely sighed shut on the chaos outside when the room settled into a taut, breathing quiet, and the floor of the gallery shifted in a gentle ripple. Jasmine stood with her case strapped over her shoulder, the edges of the folded map snug against her palm, when an elderly man rose from the back row and began the slow walk down the aisle. Security tracked him on instinct, then relaxed as the chairman gave a slight nod, granting the moment its space. He moved with the careful balance of someone who had known hard ground, shoulders square, chin lifted, the silver in his hair catching the white light. Each step clicked softly against the marble, a steady metronome that cut through the last of the rustle. Jasmine turned toward him as he drew close, her stance unchanged, her breathing even. The room watched in a hush that felt deeper than silence, as if the air itself had decided to hold still. He reached the table and paused, not to speak first, but to look her fully in the eyes. That look carried history, weight without theatrics, gratitude without performance. Then his right hand lifted, open, firm, offered not as a courtesy but as a testimony. His hand met hers in a grip that was warm and strong, calloused palm to calm resolve, the shake simple and absolute. Up close, the lines in his face read like a map of years spent standing his ground. Each crease a road, each scar a mile marker. His shoulders stayed square as he spoke, voice steady, eyes bright, the words coming out like a flag raised and claimed. "You gave us our voice back." He didn't let go as he said it. The pressure of his hand matched the force of the sentence. The us stretched beyond his frame, to the names stripped from rolls, to the neighborhoods left blank on a map, to every pair of hands that had built a life only to be told it didn't count. In the first row, a woman pressed her lips together, nodding once, as if sealing the moment into memory. The chairman's gaze softened a fraction, a private acknowledgement in a public room. Jasmine gave a small incline of her head, not bowing to praise, but meeting the truth in his statement head-on. Their hands released slowly, not out of hesitation, but the way a bridge lowers after traffic has passed. Work done, connection made, path cleared. For a beat, neither of them moved. The man's fingers hovered near hers as if reluctant to break the current, then folded back at his side. He took half a step away but stayed close, shoulders still aligned with the table, as if to stand guard for one breath longer. A chair creaked somewhere behind them. Papers were set down without their usual snap. Even the soft hum of the air vents felt like it had dimmed. Jasmine's case rode easy against her hip, the recorder a steady weight in the jacket pocket over her heart. She looked at the man once more, a promise held without words, then turned her focus forward. The committee sat straighter, as though every spine in the room had just been ratcheted one notch. The old man gave a short, respectful nod and stayed where he was, present without intruding, witness without demand. What hung in the air was not applause and not accusation. It was resolve, quiet, sharpened, unbreakable. The moment called not for more evidence, but for a message. A camera light steadied in the corner, its red dot unwavering, and the official lens found its line through the clearing in the gallery. Jasmine shifted just enough to face it fully, shoulders squared, chin level, the stance of someone who understands exactly what a single sentence can carry once it leaves the room. The officers by the door stood easy but alert, guardians of order rather than enforcers of fear. A staffer set a pen down and clasped both hands, as if bracing for impact that was moral rather than physical. The chairman leaned back, not in retreat, but to give the center of gravity to the person who had earned it. Jasmine's breath set, steady and controlled, a measured rise and fall beneath the line of her jacket. She glanced briefly at the table's smooth wood, a battlefield cleared, a record made, then lifted her eyes to the lens and held it. The world outside would add noise soon enough. Inside, this would be the clean line drawn in ink. She planted her feet as if on bedrock and let the room come to her, not the other way around. Her voice landed without strain, powered by conviction rather than volume. Each word carried on clean air and hard truth. Democracy is not a gift from government. The sentence stood up straight, unflinching, like a post set in concrete. She let it breathe, not to savor it, but to let it occupy the space it deserved. It is the people's promise, and we will keep it. The dash snapped like a hinge, locking the thought into place, and the final clause flowed with the weight of a vow made in the open where it could be measured. No flourish, no extra heat, just the precise heat of a welded seam. Somewhere near the aisle, the old man exhaled softly, the release not of relief, but of recognition. In the committee semicircle, a pair of eyes glistened and then steadied, the emotion held tight so the meaning could stand taller. There was nothing left to add and nothing to take away. The words were the right size for the moment. The room seemed to lean into the statement rather than away from it, as if the architecture itself had shifted a fraction towards center. The gallery did not erupt. It settled, deeper and wider, like water finding its level after the shock of a stone. The officer's posture didn't change, but the tension in their forearms let go a notch, a human reaction beneath a uniform surface. A staffer in the corner whispered, "Got it," to the clerk, meaning the line was captured, time-stamped, preserved. The chairman's eyes lowered to the transcript and rose again, satisfied in the quiet way of people who prefer records to speeches. The old man stayed at Jasmine's side, not touching her, but standing with her the way a standard stands beside a standard bearer. In the front row, a young intern pressed a palm to her notebook, fingers whitening at the tips as if to keep the words from lifting off the page. The room was not waiting for permission to believe. It had been given the language with which to believe out loud. Jasmine turned slightly, breaking from the camera's center line, to face the people in the room one last time. The motion was minimal, but it changed the angle of her eyes, putting each face back into view, restoring the circle of duty before the wider ring of the world closed in. She nodded once to the chairman, a professional seal, then once to the old man, a personal one. He returned the nod with the smallest smile at its edge, not joy, not triumph, recognition, plain and clear. Her fingers settled on the strap of her case, a reflex more than a pose, like a runner's hand finding the staggered blocks before the gun. The recorder sat light but certain in her inner pocket, a truth captured and carried. The map, folded tight and true, lay as flat inside the case as the facts it had shown. Someone coughed and apologized in a hush, and the hush accepted it, then returned to its focused hum. The message had landed. Now it would travel. Overhead, the cold white light eased forward as a fixture's focus shifted, drawing a clean beam across Jasmine's face. It wasn't theatrical. It was the natural sweep of a mounted lamp settling after a long session, but it framed her nonetheless. The line of her jaw caught the edge of brightness, cutting a strong silhouette that made her eyes look even steadier. Tiny flecks in the dark fabric of her jacket picked up the glow, the way dust catches a shaft of sun in a quiet room. The camera read the light as contrast, and the contrast told a story. Resolve without anger, strength without swagger, certainty without noise. The old man's profile entered the same wash, brow high, chin set, the map of his years lit rather than hidden. The beam held there, not hot, not soft, just clean and exact, chiseling the details the way a sculptor's final pass reveals what was always there. Around them, faces in the gallery lifted, drawn instinctively to the brightness that didn't blind, but clarified. The frame, woman and witness, message and moment, locked into place. For a few seconds more, the room allowed itself to be still, letting the image carve into memory while the words settled into the ledger. A pen clicked and then didn't, as if the hand holding it thought better of breaking the quiet with plastic. Shoes shifted under chairs, heels finding balance instead of escape. The officers by the door exchanged a silent glance that said only, "Order kept, moment honored." The chairman gathered a page and squared its corners to the stack, a small ritual of precision that matched the day's demands. The clerk touched the timestamp and looked up, receiving a slight nod that meant enough. The old man finally stepped back half a pace, not to retreat, but to widen the frame so she stood at its center without obstruction. Jasmine neither followed him nor filled the space he left. She stood her ground and let the ground belong to the words she had placed on it. The light did not flicker. The camera did not blink. The image held. When the spell broke, it did so gently, like a curtain lowering in slow motion rather than snapping shut. The hum of the building returned first, the air handling its endless, careful work, the far-off elevator bell, the faint murmur of staff beyond the doorway. The gallery rose in quiet, respectful motion, not to leave in a rush, but to absorb the moment while still inside it. A single hand touched Jasmine's case in passing, a light brush that asked nothing and said only, "Thank you." The old man turned at last, taking the aisle with the same steady pace he had brought down, every step measured, every step sure. A chair's rubber foot squeaked and then apologized to the floor with a second, softer sound. A staffer inhaled like a person who had forgotten to breathe and then remembered. The chairman folded his hands and waited for the room to move before he did. The light stayed. Jasmine looked once more at the lens, not to add to what she had said, but to hold eye contact with the record itself. The promise was in the sentence already captured. The keeping of it would be the work after the doors opened again. Her features stayed composed, the set of her mouth firm but not hard, the lift of her chin equal parts humility and command. She let the camera see all of it, the way a witness lets a jury see the whole truth without trimming the edges. Then she turned from the lens back to the living room around her. The people breathing in the same air, the people who had heard the line as it was meant to be heard. The old man was 3 rows up the aisle now, not looking back because he didn't need to. The officers eased their stance another notch, the kind of ease that comes when the center holds. The light, unwavering and clean, sealed the last image with a steady hand. And there it stayed, Jasmine Crockett under the white beam, features calm, eyes bright, the set of her face carved by conviction rather than pride. The room around her bore the marks of a day that had cut deep, papers squared, chairs askew, a microphone still lit, a case strap pulled tight across a shoulder that hadn't bowed. The sentence she had given the camera hung in the air like fresh paint, the kind that would outlast the weather. The old man's words lingered close behind it. "You gave us our voice back, not as a caption, but as proof." On the marble, the soft echo of retreating steps faded into a useful quiet. In the corner, the red light burned on, watching without judgment, storing without distortion. And in the final frame, with the beam of light holding fast and the lines of her resolve etched clean and unmistakable. The image of Jasmine did not merely end the scene, it set the standard it demanded others meet. The light held on Jasmine's face, and the room exhaled into a fragile stillness. It was not the stillness of victory, but the stillness that follows a truth spoken without flinching. In that frame, the story stopped acting like spectacle and started behaving like responsibility. A map had been unfolded, a voice had been played, and a sentence had been written into the record. What remained was not applause or scandal, but the part that lives after both. The lesson. Every witness in that chamber carried a different past, yet the same pressure sat on each chest. It said that ballots are not paper scraps but breath, and breath cannot be negotiated away. It said that power looks loud until evidence speaks, and then even a whisper can move a building. From that quiet, the meaning took the microphone. Democracy, stripped of slogans, is bodies showing up and being counted. It is neighbors in line before dawn, names spelled correctly, addresses that exist, and records that match a life. It is numbers with faces attached and faces with futures attached, not just columns on a fundraising slide. The figure pinned to the map, 12,487, was not a statistic but a roll call. Behind it stood nurses on night shifts, soldiers with folded letters, grandmothers with church hats, and teenagers wearing their first sticker. Erasure did not delete apathy. It attempted to delete people. That is why the veteran's voice felt heavier than any speech, because blood understands paperwork in ways policy rarely admits. A nation does not suffocate all at once. It loses breath precinct by precinct, minute by minute, unless someone opens a window. The lesson began with that window being forced back up. Power in this story wore a tailored suit and carried a gold pen, but its strongest weapon was bureaucracy. Forms, stamps, metadata, and timing became the blades, cutting in silence where cameras rarely look. The counterweight was not a louder voice, it was receipts, chain of custody, matching timestamps, verified sources, and the courage to display them in unforgiving light did the work. In that sense, justice proved less like thunder and more like calibration, restoring what had been tilted until it read true. The lesson was simple enough to carry, but hard enough to practice. Emotion may break a door, but documentation keeps it open. A small recorder defeated a long speech because evidence respects neither rank nor swagger. A federal seal backed a quiet map because truth arrives with companions, not with volume. When institutions drift, instruments must tighten. Courage here did not look like shouting, it looked like steadiness. It was a woman refusing bait, pacing her breaths, and letting facts walk in ahead of her name. It was a veteran standing in the cheap seats and anchoring the room with a sentence that could not be argued. It was a chairman choosing duty over theater, and staffers who treated the transcript like a lifeline. It was security holding the perimeter without turning the scene into a spectacle. Each action was small up close, but together they drew a hard line across the floor. The lesson inside that line was quiet and unforgiving. Complicity loves noise, but accountability prefers silence. Silence, however, is not absence. It is the space where decisions are made and records are made permanent. The lasting courage is the kind that can stand inside that space without blinking. If a story is worth anything, it must become instructions ordinary hands can use. Communities can protect the breath of the ballot with unglamorous habits that do not trend but do endure. Registrations can be checked early, roll errors challenged in writing, and polling locations verified with 2 sources. Neighbors can be walked to early vote lines, translation sheets printed for elders, and transportation pooled for those who cannot drive. Workers can take shifts as poll monitors, clerks, and chain of custody witnesses, bringing lunch and patience to rooms that need both. Local papers can be fed documents, not rumors, and city councils can be asked for audits before the fire starts, not after. Faith groups, unions, and classrooms can adopt precincts the way parks are adopted, keeping them clean of confusion and neglect. Young organizers can be paired with seasoned ones so that technique passes on with the same care as conviction. None of this requires spectacle. All of it prevents erasure. Public office in this lesson is not a throne, but a borrowed key. Those who hold it should open rooms, not lock them, and should count voices, not curate them. Any strategy that shrinks participation confesses its own poverty before the first vote is cast. A platform that survives only by silence is not governance. It is dependency on shadows. The standard set on that floor was straightforward. Serve the whole or step aside. Consequences, when delivered cleanly, are not a grudge. They are maintenance. A nation does not stay upright by inspiration alone. It stands because someone tightens the bolts when they loosen. Oversight is the wrench, and transparency is the light over the workbench. Leaders who understand that tend to last. Those who do not tend to explain. The day also taught something modern and non-negotiable. Truth now travels with data. Timestamps either line up or they do not, and signatures either match or they do not. Good faith begins in metadata, then grows in daylight. A phone the size of a deck of cards can collapse an empire of adjectives if it holds a clean recording. Screenshots cannot replace subpoenas, but receipts can escort subpoenas to the door. The strongest witness remains a human being, and the strongest partner that witness has is a verifiable record. Together they form a bridge that even the loudest denial cannot burn. That bridge is how a country crosses back to itself after drifting. The lesson, stripped to bone, is brutal and bright. Bring receipts or bring silence. Accountability, rightly handled, is not vengeance. It is care for the future. The goal is not to break a rival. The goal is to protect a student who has not yet entered a voting booth. Consequences tell future hands how to behave when the room is less crowded and the cameras are asleep. Grace is not the absence of consequence. Grace is the presence of a path back after truth is faced. Those who cross the line can return to civic life, but not while holding the pen that redraws the line. Mercy without memory repeats harm. Memory without mercy freezes a country in place. The balance is hard, and that is why the work must be shared across institutions, not carried by heroes alone. The veteran's steady voice and the chair's steady hand were not rival energies, they were a match set. Together they build a door that closes on abuse and opens on participation. Institutions heard a different directive than individuals, and the distinction matters. Courts must guard process like firefighters guard hydrants, because dry hoses cost lives long after flames die. Press rooms must treat primary documents as oxygen and rumors as smoke that signals where to look, not what to print. Classrooms must teach the machinery of counting with the same pride used to teach the poetry of freedom. Parties must court persuasion rather than scarcity, because scarcity makes enemies out of neighbors in a single cycle. Departments must fund the unflashy backbone of elections, databases, training, coatings on paper that block tampering without waiting for a scandal. Faith leaders can remind congregations that a ballot cast is a prayer answered only when everyone can offer one. Labor halls can keep sign-in tables open longer than speeches run because ownership is spelled with ink before it is shouted from a stage. The lesson was not a slogan to chant, it was a checklist to renew. In the end, the lesson refused to shrink into a headline and instead stretched into a vow. Let ballots be treated as breath, records as ribs, and communities as the lungs that keep the nation alive. Let office be rented space for service, not purchased air for vanity. Let maps be unfolded when the weather turns, and let recorders rest until the storm forgets what it tried to do. Let veterans and students share aisles, so memory can walk with imagination to the same table. Let consequences be firm, and let doors remain open for reform that arrives with honest hands. The message that walked out of that chamber was not a shout, it was a cadence meant for marching. It said that democracy stays awake when ordinary people keep ordinary promises on extraordinary days. Those born with a microphone must learn to listen before using it, because the truth does not come with an edit button. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.